Hello, everyone, and welcome to our October edition of Poets in Conversation here at A Mighty Blaze. If you're unfamiliar with A Mighty Blaze, let me just remind everyone that we are a social media company that exists in order to connect writers with readers during the pandemic and beyond. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome two fantastic poets to be in conversation with each other and with all of us, Dorianne Laux and Chloe Martinez. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's especially exciting to have you both here, considering that you both have new works that are out. Dorianne, everyone knows, I think, about Only as the Day is Long, your very celebrated collection that just came out in 2020. But I think fewer people know, and everyone will be excited to learn about the chapbook of your recent poems, Salt, which we'll be talking about today. So I'm really excited to hear about the relationship between this sort of highly reflective collection and the high reflective act of putting together a new and selected, and then this new sort of small chapbook that kind of reemerges and starts again. And then Chloe, your beautiful 10,000 Selves collection, which is a very, so many sort of twists to it, so many narrative elements to it, lyric elements. There's just so much going on. So I know that you're excited to talk to each other, and we're all excited to have you here. So welcome again to you both.
Thanks,
Thank
Allison.
you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I always say, like, I had this boyfriend once who, whenever we would take long drives, like across the country or whatever, I would have, mixes, like cassette mixes. And every song that came on, I would say, oh, I love this song, like as if I was surprised. And he would say, of course you love it. You made the mix. So every month when we do Poets in Conversation, I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. It's these two poets I like. Of course it is, because I invited you guys. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. And selfishly, just as a fellow poet, I'm excited. I want to introduce you so that everyone knows a little bit about your backgrounds and your work. Just to start, Chloe Martinez is a poet and scholar of South Asian religions. She's the author of Corner Shrine, which won the 2019 Backbone Press Chapbook Competition. A former Mellon Mays Fellow and Holden Scholar, Chloe's poems have appeared in Plowshares, Prairie Schooner, Shenandoah, The Common, Waxwing, and elsewhere. Chloe lives in Claremont, California with her husband and two daughters. About her new collection, 10,000 Selves, poet Suzanne Buffum says, Martinez understands the power of stories to transmute experience into knowledge and the power of poetry to question stories' power. I really appreciated that, how narrative can be both anchoring and disruptive in the poetic form. So welcome to you, Chloe. And I know we're both excited to be in conversation with Dorianne Laux, who, by the way, as I think many people do, I once pronounced your name, Dorianne, as Dorianne Laux, L-A-U-X. And Alan Shapiro, who was in the room, looked at me kind of sideways and said, like, I think he was trying to figure out if I was trying to be pretentious, but I wasn't. I had just been in high school French too long. Anyhow, Dorianne Laux, right? Like, that's good enough? Laux?
Yes, it's absolutely right. I mean, it is French name.
How do you say it?
We say, my family says Laux.
Oh, Laux. Okay, good. I want to make sure to get it right.
My mother's maiden name is Comeau. I mean, French. I am French. I'm Acadian French. So
a side note, so interesting, by the way, of all people, Jack Kerouac apparently wrote his first novel, I think it was, in like Acadian French. You know, there's this whole, and he wrote this letter to his mother saying, let's live together and we can just speak our home language and not have to worry about. Anyhow, side note. More importantly, to get to your background, Dorianne Laux's sixth collection, Only as the Day is Long, new and selected poems, which I think everyone has heard of, was named a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her fifth collection, The Book of Men, was awarded the Patterson Prize. Her fourth book of poems, Facts About the Moon, won the Oregon Book Award and was shortlisted for the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize. Laux is also the author of Awake, What We Carry, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, Smoke, as well as a fine small press edition, The Book of Women. Dorianne is the co-author of the celebrated text, The Poet's Companion, a guide to the pleasures of writing poetry, or as I refer to it, the Poet's Bible, which I have been teaching from for years, and I'm teaching from this semester. So shout out to my students who are here. Of Only as the Day is Long, one reviewer writes, quote, "The ability to write accessible poetry is proof that Laux is an expert. She captures human sentiment and weaves emotions into multi-sensory landscapes with accurate details. Rich with detailed, layered poems, Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected Poems, is a collection of Laux' finest." And I would say, just wait till that person gets his hands on Salt. So welcome again to both of you. I wondered if we could start spinning off of this idea of accessibility. So many people do resist reading poetry or think they are resisting reading poetry because they fear that it might be impenetrable. Where do you think this idea emerged? Because we all know that poetry is like an instrument of the people, right? So where do you think the idea emerged that poetry is or should be inaccessible? And are there ways in which you think of access and sort of like connection with, a listener when you're actually writing? So Chloe, maybe I'll start with you, since a lot of your work actually has to do with information and scholarship. What do you think about this idea of accessibility?
I think it is kind of like I don't know, I think it's an American cultural notion that we have about poetry that, it's scary and hard, and maybe has to do with the way poetry has been taught in elementary school. People get a first taste of it and never want to go back to whatever kind of antiquated notion of poetry it was they had. The place that this comes into contact with my scholarship actually is that I have spent a lot of time in India doing research, and one of the things that drew me to studying South Asia was that poetry has a totally different role there. That I immediately, as soon as I was there, realized that like this idea that poetry is hard or inaccessible or scary or boring just was not part of the culture there, which made me realize, oh, it's just a culturally specific notion here. In India, like pretty much anyone you run into knows at least a little bit of poetry by heart, will recite it on command. Poets are an important and revered part of culture, I would say. I mean, I don't like to make broad general statements like that, but I do think it's true. It's been my experience over and over again.
That's been my experience too. I mean, you can't go to other countries or even get in a taxi cab in New York without somebody saying, what do you do or why are you here? Whatever. You say something about poetry and they say, oh, you're an American poet. And you say, yeah. Oh, well, tell me a poem. Who is the poet of your country? I've heard of this Walt Whitman. Tell me some of his poems. And if you can't, they go, right, you're a poet. I mean, and inevitably, whenever I talk to someone and I know the poet of their country, they'll take me anywhere, right? It's like, really? Nazim Hikmet, our beloved Nazim Hikmet? Oh, can you say one of his poems? Or I will say one of his poems, and they'll say it in unison. It's just amazing. It really is. So I don't think that's an unusual understanding of the rest of the world. I think that poetry is taught too young in some ways, and for the kinds of poems that are taught. And also later on in high school or junior college or college, it's presented as a puzzle, as a guessing game. What did they really mean? Oh, no, don't think about what they said. What do you think they're saying underneath what's being said? Or what do you think this is a symbol for? Or, I mean, it's crazy, And so I love that Billy Collins instituted having poems read during the opening hour of school. And he said, and you are not to talk about them as instructors. You never talk, just let them hear the poem and let them decide if they want to talk about it. Do not make it part of the curriculum. Make it part of their lives.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, proximity alone can do 90% of the work. You know what I mean? And one of my students in a paper this week used the word subterfuge to introduce the idea that like the author was doing more than was apparent. And I thought, well, geez, no, I don't think it's subterfuge. I say that lovingly. I think that that's the idea that there's some like pretense, there's some like effort to hide and disguise and create a riddle that only some will sort of find find the answer to. Do you remember poems that you encountered that initially made you feel excited and included? Like for me, I always say I heard C.D. Wright read her poem More Blues and the Abstract Truth in a barn in Ireland from her book String Light in like 1996, I think it was. And it just blew my mind open because there was a kind of like tone and vernacular that and a kind of intellectual sort of digression that seemed like a celebration. It just made me amazed. Can you remember any poems that did that for you?
Yes, absolutely. I had a lucky thing happen to me when I was a kid, which is that I think I was a really early reader and I was reading stuff that I didn't understand. I was kind of ahead of myself. So I think that was really good for me as a poet because I often had the experience of loving something for the language without necessarily understanding it or worrying too much about the understanding piece. I also had a fourth grade teacher who made us memorize poems, and we memorized, I memorized The Highwayman with my best friend, and we recited it in sections. I memorized Shakespeare sonnets, and that was amazing for me. That those moments of getting to feel ownership over poetry by internalizing it and saying it aloud, they were really joyful and really, really opened poetry up for me very early.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't read much poetry. I mean, besides Mother Goose and, some of the children's poems kind of thing. I was most interested in my mother's adult novels. I thought the adult world was pretty fascinating, and all their ins and outs and trials and betrayals and. But it wasn't until later that I was introduced to poetry. And then it was contemporary American poetry, and it was women poets, Carolyn Forche and Sharon Olds, but also Pablo Neruda, who was the first poet who ever made me cry. I mean, I just went, this is amazing. And they were absolutely accessible in every way. It didn't mean that there wasn't metaphor in the work. It didn't mean that there was some kind of other storyline or maybe a comparison to a myth somewhere close at hand or, it's not like poetry doesn't have those kinds of mysterious, wonderful things about them, but it's generally not the driving force of the work. It's kind of an added bonus, oh yeah, that kind of is the Icarus story told backwards, or right. I mean, that's not a huge mystery, you can figure that out if you want to. Otherwise, you read it and accept it for what it is. But I remember that happening with Emily Dickinson. When I first read Emily Dickinson, I thought, these poems, either they're too simple, they're childlike, or they're too complicated. I can't figure them out. Right. So I just kind of cast her aside. I didn't tell anyone because I was a woman poet and I should love Emily Dickinson. I just didn't. And then one day I was really depressed about poetry and felt like I was just I should just give it up, reading and writing it, and I turned on my computer and it happened to go to the Poetry Daily site or one of those, and it was this Emily Dickinson poem where she writes, "There is a pain so utter, it swallows substance up." And I just went, oh my God, what, like, I thought I didn't get this woman. I totally get this woman, And then, so my eyes were opened, but I think it took years of experience and living in order to understand really what she was saying and the depth she was going to. So it's just time, and it's great. We all have a lot of time on our hands for the most part, right? So we have time to get it.
I think there's an interesting balance in both of your work, probably in all poets' work, but in rereading your material, in rereading your collections and your materials, I was struck by the way in which this issue of like often plain speech, like both of you will sort of like drop a line to say something plain, and as an invitation and an act, I feel, of intimacy with the reader. Like, let me just say this, Chloe, I'm thinking in your poem, Inequality Poem, for example, which begins to question even the act of metaphor itself, sort of narrate the process of writing. Dorianne, there are plenty of examples in your work as well. And I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about how you, and again, I know we were talking before about how rarely is it that a poet sits there and like thinks consciously about all this stuff. But how you handle that moment in writing a poem where you start to realize what the poem is or what it's about, and how you figure out a way to maintain the poem as an act of discovery. So you're giving like an idea, there's acts of plain speech, but how do you still maintain the kind of freshness of discovery that I think we would probably all agree a poem requires? And maybe there's a poem that comes to mind from Salt or from 10,000 Selves that you worked to kind of keep fresh as you were writing it. I know that's a big question.
A second.
I felt like it really was true in your poem, Inequality Poem, as I mentioned, Chloe, in case that gives an anchor. But
I mean, I could talk about that poem and just say that I think that was a poem where I was sort of thinking around how I think that I wrote this poem. I can't remember when exactly I wrote this poem, but I was reading about something horrible in the news that made me think about inequality and made me want to put it in a poem, and also made me think like, I can't do that without being like didactic and annoying and bossy. And I think this was a moment where I was sort of working around in circles how to approach talking about social justice issues in poems, right? In ways that don't feel overly planned, right? In ways that have discovery. And for me, I think I started out in this poem with the plain speech, when you are exiled by circumstance. What is the situation I'm trying to get at? This way that circumstance changes stuff that happens to us in really serious ways, right? Changes our health, our financial situation, our stability in life can really be affected in crazy ways by kind of random circumstance. For me, the place where this poem was able to stay a poem or come together as a poem was when I kind of let myself go into the metaphor of thinking about the person up the tree and imagining that experience. What is it like climbing a tree, right? So I was able to maybe put something very specific and real to me, the experience of being in a tree or having a picnic or looking around a landscape, and use that as a way to talk about this abstraction that, of course, abstractions aren't very interesting for poems, right? So it became concrete for me when I went up the tree in the poem.
how about you, Dorianne? Is there a poem that occurs to you that required some tousling as you were writing it?
It's hard to think about the struggle because you're so deeply within it. It's enmeshed in the whole process. It's pretty hard to pull out what you might be struggling with, in the writing. I can certainly, and all of us could speak to the struggling in the rewriting, or the revision. But the poem itself, I am so deeply in the poem that I really don't think about it much. But when I look back and I think about the poem Facts About the Moon, which really was just my desire to restate the facts I had learned in watching this Discovery Channel special about the moon, and I just wanted to find some container for all that information that I thought was astounding and wonderful and scary, right? Also terrifying in some way, and how that terror and excitement were kind of enmeshed in the poem, I mean in the facts. And then what surprised me, and you talk about one of those lines, where I basically say, I don't care what you think or what anybody else, I'm just afraid for the moon, like I didn't predict I was going to say that, but I could have predicted it because I was very much influenced by Philip Levine. And I remember he has a line about, I don't care, right? There's this, I don't kind of care attitude. And then I think he actually uses the phrase, forget us, right? And so that phrase came to mind. And then that whole shift to where I'm pitying the moon, and then I'm thinking of a mother who's lost a child to drug use. And no matter how many bad things he's done, she can't help but love him. And that this became a metaphor for the moon. A moon loves the earth no matter what we do to the earth. You know, the earth loves the moon, no matter how. I mean, you know, they're, again, I keep using the word, enmeshed. You know, and that was a shocker. I had never expected that my mind would go there. I was really intent on the facts, and the facts led somehow, and also this kind of complete avowal, you know, of the audience, this complete dismissiveness of the audience. Like, forget you. I'm just going to say what I want to say, you know, and clearly that was putting pressure on my mind, this whole idea of a mother's love and how unrequited it could be and how she doesn't care. You know, you can do anything you want to me. I'll always be your mother and I will always love you, you know. And that just seemed astounding to me, as astounding as the facts, you know. So
I wonder too, you know, it's funny because I think probably we tend to talk about metaphor as if the two things being related are distinct, you know, from each other. Rather, both of you are talking about a kind of permeability where these things, like, you know, are sort of constantly talking back to each other, not just a kind of one-to-one transfer, but like there's this sort of like ongoing charge, which I think is really interesting. And I feel like you can see in both of your collections too, in your collection, Dorianne, and the chapbook, and Chloe in your collection, 10,000 Selves. Well, I don't know. I know that everyone must be feeling this, if I'm feeling this, just like a longing to hear the actual poems. So maybe, Chloe, I can turn it to you first. I don't know. I had thought maybe you would be up for reading at Red Bucket Equine Rescue, but maybe you have that poem in mind or a different poem in mind, and just maybe set it up for us. Tell us a little bit about it, if you would.
Sure. Thank you. I would love to read that poem. Lately, I've been having a lot of trouble like choosing what poems I want to read for reading. So I'm really happy to have you say, do this one. Yeah. So this is one of a bunch of poems that I was writing kind of in the year before lockdown when I was tagging along to my older daughter's Girl Scout trips, which was really wonderful for me because I got to sort of have these little experiences with her where I was kind of like in the event, but sort of on the edge of it, which is a great way to think about poems. And we took a trip to this local horse rescue farm, which was really amazing. And I was also reading Joy Harjo at the time. So this little quote from Joy Harjo came into the poem. The quote, which is the epigraph, and it gets into the middle of the poem as well, is "The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun," which is just such an amazing line that has in it this sort of like microcosm, macrocosm thing, right? Your body and the universe and all of the kind of relationships between the things that we do individually and the things that we do as communities. All that was on my mind when I was writing this poem. At Red Bucket Equine Rescue. Maybe your horse heart was abandoned some time ago. Maybe it was beaten with a broomstick or left to whittle itself down in hunger to a set of ribs rolling under a dull coat. Even our history of violence may be redeemable. The heart waits, hot, dusty, and barely breathing. Go with a bucket. Wash the heart gently. Feed it up. It will in time grow sleek and healthy again. If it fears you, be infinitely patient. Wait, each day with a gift. If it mourns or ruminates on the past, place a long-eared donkey at all times beside it. A donkey is the best helpmate and companion to your bruised heart. Day in and day out, together they seek the shade, they eat. One morning, they attempt a gentle trot around the enclosure. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun, says Joy. Does it feel heavy? Is it panicky, bucking under your shirt? Have patience. Your heart is at home in your chest. Let it rest there. The burning you feel is not hatred of your enemies, not a reaction to eating too many chilies, not the planet warming, though all those things are there. The burning you feel is your knowledge of everything, your momentous life. Your heat, your heart, it all means you mean something. It makes you make meaning. If it hurts, be still a while. Your heart galloping, panting like a herd of wild horses.
Thank you so much. Hard to believe that this is what emerges from a Girl Scout trip, but that's how it works, I guess. You have that second sight.
Girl Scouts are amazing. They can make poems happen.
Yeah. Build
I actually
fires, make poems. Yeah.
I remember it well, all those like threading the sit-upons and, getting tree bark for this and that, people sleep on Girl Scouts. They shouldn't. It's a very important thing. Chloe, before we move to Dorianne, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the book overall. I noticed there's so many different forms that you explore in the book. There's Aubade, abecedarian, villanelle, etc. And Dorianne, when I come to you in a second, we have an almost sonnet in Salt, or I'm interested to know how much you think of it as an almost sonnet. Do you find, Chloe, the form in the book like freeingly restrictive, something else? Like how does that impact your writing process to consider a kind of received form or a tradition?
Yes, I think form is, freeingly restrictive. I think Dorianne talked a minute ago about like a container, right? How do we find a container for the thing we're trying to do in a poem, but also maybe the thing we're trying to figure out in a poem? And for me, sometimes a form is a moment where I can kind of unlock that. The villanelle in the book is one that it's a self-describing villanelle where a friend said, let's write villanelles. And I had not attempted to write a villanelle in a long time. And I don't know if I'd ever successfully written one. I was like, I don't think I can do that. Right. But immediately the challenge and the form let me do something, which was really, the poem ends up being kind of about like the chaos of motherhood and the inability I was having at that moment to feel like I could write anything or have a continuous thought or get anything done. Of course, a restrictive form is the perfect place to talk about chaos and disorder, right? Because it gives you that tension and that balance between the two things. So I don't usually sit down and intend to write in a form, although I did that time, but often a form will be something I'll turn to when I'm stuck or when I've written a draft and it's kind of sprawling and I need a way to give shape to it. Sometimes I'll think, well, what if I tried crunching it into a sonnet size? Or what if I thought about the line length, particularly around meter? That can be so helpful. It's almost like a way of distracting yourself, right? So that the subconscious stuff that needs to happen in the poem can get through.
How about you, Dorianne? I wanted to turn, if you would, to from Salt, Any Other Waylord. And I found myself chiding myself for even beginning to think of it as a sonnet form, because it doesn't have 14 lines. But then I was like, well, there are echoes and the end rhyme. So I was wondering if you thought of it at all in those terms. And if you ever think about form, as part of the anchor for your work.
Certainly not in the beginning, although when I first started writing poems as a young girl, I wrote in form exclusively because that's what I thought poetry was, that it was metered and rhymed and that it was end rhymed. And, so I would write, da, 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 and I put in little stories, but in this kind of form of what I thought was a poem. So for years I did this. For years I worked and, not in any kind of studied way. I just, followed the pattern. And then when I first read like E. Cummings, I thought, oh my God, you mean you don't have to write in form? And that freed me up. And ever since then I, narrative, long, free verse, narrative poems, it was so much freedom to get out of the form, but with the, and every year I give myself the challenge to write a sonnet because I think sonnets are really important. I love Shakespeare sonnets. I have memorized a lot of Shakespeare sonnet, but I can't write one for the life of me, But every year I try. And I think, well, maybe one of these times I'll be successful if I could just write one sonnet in my life. And when I would try, sometimes I'd get a poem out of it, but it wouldn't really fit into the sonnet form. So I'd just take it out of that and let it be free. But it would still have kind of the echo of a sonnet. And then for Only As the Day Is Long, I actually did write sonnets for my mother. But again, I used like John Donne poem, one of his holy sonnet. I used his last words, his end words, so I could write toward the word that already rhymed. Because half of the problem with sonnets is you're trying to rhyme words, and a lot of times it ends up awkward because, but if you're going toward a ready-made rhyme, it's a lot easier, And so it's not like I haven't had a lot of practice at this kind of thing, but I did not mean to do that with any other way, Lord. However, I'm sure the echoes of everything, and it seemed like it fit into this sort of possible form.
I know it's one of your shorter poems, but it has such a raw-edged quality to it. I was wondering if you would be willing to read it as one of the poems from
Sure,
Salt.
sure. Any other way, Lord. A mother's grief smells sweet as rotten peaches, a transparency in the eyes, the stance of exile, her dress hanging from her shoulders like bad geometry, the desire of bees at the funeral flowers, a reminder of a daughter's wounded flesh, a son's mango-colored shirt. Memory is the refusal to listen to the music of survival, surrounded by gravestones, the buried bones of the unknown future, each family stunned in their own way, each day a burden, each night a black veil needled with stars.
I love that poem. The line memory, the sentence, I should say, the lines, plural, memory is the refusal to listen to the music of survival. It's so interesting for a poem for a few reasons. One of the reflections I had on it was that there's this really compelling music of survival that in order for poetry to kind of truth tell has to like buck against, that it has to buck against like the lullaby of, this song of survival. And I was wondering for both of you, if what you think of as poetry as a kind of ongoing confrontation with the past, with history, with ideas, with personal past, versus a way to sort it. I'm thinking of like Gregory Orr's Poetry as Survival, for example, in which it's a really compelling book, right? Where he talks about poems, any art creation allows us to create experiences as an object and reimagine them so that we can examine them and understand them and essentially exert some control over them. I think of that as sort of sorting the past. But then, a sentence like that, memory is the refusal to listen to the music of survival, reminds me that poetry is often trying to disrupt rather than settle. So I was wondering what both of you think about that question of like disruption versus settling and putting things in order. You want to start, Dorianne? I feel like this is definitely a key in your work.
Well, it's both, a mother standing at a graveside of her child, um, memory is her enemy in a way, right? Because it's an enemy to her survival. She needs to bury that child and move forward, and she can't, because memory in a way is her enemy. And then, you can flip that too, in the way that you did. So, but in terms of poetry, a lot of the reason I began to write poetry was, as you say, to truth tell, but also to validate my own memories, because my family's memories were very different than mine, and I felt I needed to find a place for them that would survive the whatever lies or misinterpretations or not want blindness that my family had. So it was survival, to be able to remember these things through my lens alone, for whatever good that is. As we know, writers, we and human beings, we never remember everything perfectly, and we'll never, there's no way to test that. Unless you put yourself in a lab, and experience everything you experienced in childhood. What a torture. That would be a torture chamber, But
I feel like this creates a special complication in your case, Chloe, because a lot of the poems really have to do with, I wouldn't say scholarship in that in a narrow sense, but engaging with materials that come outside of the personal lyric experience. So, what is your thought on this?
Yeah, when I was making this book, I had a lot of trouble figuring out how I wanted to put those different kinds of poems together because the book does kind of, it has these different materials. It has poems that are very personal and are poems of, personal experience and kind of the lyric. And then it has poems that are sort of weirdly research based, right? Poems that came out of my time wandering around India doing research or living there, learning language. I did, my chapbook is sort of all the India poems. So I first thought about like, maybe these are just a separate thing. And I just need to make a book that's just about this engagement with India, which is partly experiential, partly like a place where I've spent a lot of time and had experiences, and partly research-based, partly thinking about how do we look into texts and especially pre-modern texts and think about commonalities between people distant from ourselves who also are talking about stuff that's very familiar and immediate to us. So when I went from the chapbook to this collection, I spent a lot of time working out, like, do these India poems fit in there? Do they match up with my other poems about like going on a field trip with Girl Scouts? And I finally felt that they did, but I did end up sort of weaving them throughout the book rather than like an early version of the book had them as their own section. Like now the book's going to go to India, right? That didn't seem very useful. I was interested in the way that my engagement with research materials and old manuscripts and Mughal memoirs and all of these sort of unlikely non-modern materials has a lot to do with my personal immediate contemporary experience, right? That there's some of the same thought processes are going on in there. Some of the same experiences are in those poems, even though the materials are very, very different. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that what I'm interested in the research stuff is still the kind of the same stuff that I'm interested in when I'm with the Girl Scouts, which is about the ways that a new experience can give us a new understanding of the world, right? Or the way that we move through the world in relation to one another in different ways. So, I have poems about like Mughal emperors, but really my poem about like Babur at Agra is really about displacement and longing for home and what makes us happy, right? I was interested in the ways that we could find that familiar experience in very unlikely places.
Yes, they both do seem like an act of, Menander, right? It was the Greek dramatist Menander who said, those who can read see twice as well, like that in reading and writing, you sort of have experienced something and you revisit it. And I found that the positioning of the poems made me think of both of them differently, both sort of threads, or I should say the multiple threads in your book. They sort of chime together. A better way to think of it is the anti-Donna Vreeland idea of like things don't match, they go. And so they don't always match up perfectly. And that's sort of the charm, is that they go in a way that's much more intuitive and in terms of gut sense. How about you, Dorianne? Is there a poem especially that occurs to you when you think about this sort of question about putting together the collection, etc.?
Oh, well, when I think about my first collection, it was your typical 3-section book, like childhood, young adulthood, or, and then looking outward toward the world, and then like in little sections, whatever. And it worked, but from then on, I really did want to try to do more like what Chloe's doing, interweave things so that they felt that they were all connected somehow and that there was nothing that was apart, from. And so even in the Book of Men, even though it's separated into sort of sections of here are poems about men and then here are poems about women, there are poems about men in the women's section and there are poems about women in the men's section. It's like, I always want to try to write, shake it up and make things connect. With the Only As the Day Is Long, it became an issue because I had to have new poems and they had to be in their own section. And the books had to be in their own sections, you know, so that was tough. But I realized that because my mother has always been my muse, there were poems about her throughout the book. So it didn't matter that they then focused on her toward the end, you know, at the end of the book. It was like a culmination of her influence in my life. And so that worked out fine. But yeah, I love Chloe's idea. And I always, you know, suggest to students, don't, you know, section off your book. These are the poems about my brother. These are the poems. The reason I had to do the new and selected was because I couldn't figure out how I could get poems about my mother into a regular book because they would overwhelm all the other poems. I mean, I couldn't have a poem about, like you say, about the Girl Scouts and then have a poem about my mother dying, you know? I mean, you know, or a funny poem. It just was too hard to do. And that Joe said, well, why don't you do a new and selected and just put the poems about your mother at the end? And I thought, that's brilliant, you know. And then, of course, I end up writing Salt, which has poems about my mother. I mean, I will never stop writing about my mother. So I have a whole book's worth of poems just about my mother. As should we all.
It's so interesting, though, because it makes it seem like the poems in the new and selected got a new life by being positioned next to the new poems about the mother. And so it's funny, I was just talking about this in class today. I did this exercise with my students in a class called Truth Telling, where I cut up little plot points and shuffled them and gave each group the shuffled set of plot points. And I said, put them in order. And of course, we talked about decisions, you know, narrative building, how sequence implies a kind of causal relationship and so on and so forth. There's a related question that has come in from one of our loyal viewers, Mandana, that I want to pose. I think it has to do with how you think about your poems and how you visit them and revisit them when you're putting together a collection. So Mandana says, oh, sorry, I double-clicked it there. Mandana says, often fledgling poets think the progression is from chapbook to full collection, or think of the progression from chapbook to full collection as a one-way trajectory. I'd love to learn what the chapbook offers and allows you to create beyond the full collection. Dorianne, I think this is especially directed to you because you're going from the new and selected back to the chapbook. But Chloe, then we can hear from you too, since you had beautiful Corner Shrine come out recently as well. So what do you think, Dorianne?
Well, for one thing, I mean, you can do with the chapbook something you can't do generally with a you know, a regular book. I mean, like, you know, Vaughn just made this beautiful art object. And also I've always loved chapbooks. I mean, I have you know, the Book of Women, which is a gorgeous, you know, book and chapbook, and is actually even, you know, illustrated. And it's like, I've always loved chapbooks. I never had a chapbook before I had a full-length collection. So for me, chapbooks are just augmentations. They're beautiful artifacts, you know, and you can put poems in them and put them together in a way that in a larger collection, they would not have the same resonance as they do in a very short, you know, collection. So, and you're right. It's almost like, you know, the poems about my mother in there are like an addendum to, you know, the new and selected. But I'm still writing poems about, I mean, that Singer poem is about my mother, you know, and it's not in anything yet. I mean, it's not even published. And so I don't know. It's a hard, you know, question to answer because whatever your obsessions are, they're going to be. And Chloe's going to continue to write about the things that obsess her, as well as things that she finds fascinating or interesting. But really, the obsession stays the same.
I find myself reading Salt as an aperitif, you know, like and actually wondering, you know, okay, so is this like a precursor, like a preface to what's to come in the next book? Before we pass it to Chloe, I wondered, Dorianne, if you would be willing to read Spirit Level from Salt, which is such a beautiful poem. I heard you read it recently, and I think people would really enjoy it.
You know, it's funny. My our next door neighbor died recently. and his family's over there now, getting his things together. And Joe was left some things by this man, Dale, old guy who used to be a drywaller, his whole life. And he left Joe some tools. And one of the things he left him was a spirit level. And so we have this inherited spirit level. And a lot of people don't know what it is, but it's the thing you use to measure whether or not a surface is level. And it has a little bit of alcohol and an air bubble in a window, enclosed window, that shows you when things are level. I think they're fascinating tools. And but this poem is called Spirit Level. And there's a quote from Gary Snyder where he says, when making an axe handle, the pattern is not far off. And of course, that assumes that you're carving an axe handle with an axe. But who knows? I mean, I've never carved an axe handle, so I wouldn't know how it's done. Anyway, spirit level. My mother was either horizontal on the couch or vertical, a plumb line from her spine to the top of her head, to the ceiling that spins when she drinks. Alcohol and an air bubble trapped, sealed, and fixed inside her. Her face carved from wood, a tear gliding slowly down the curve of her cheek. My mother was once a spirit in this world. Once she breathed for me, above me, beside me, behind me. Now I feel her warm breath on my neck summer nights, peering over my shoulder as I write every poem, whispering, "Let me in." I let her in. I remember every time she picked me up or set me down, put me to bed or woke me from dreams. And now I see how my whole life has been a dream, one she built for me from the ground up. Her daughter, my mother, the axe, beautiful tool with which she shaped me. A house much like the one she lived in, but smaller, fewer rooms, a tiny, unusable attic, and a cluttered basement. I let her in, like she let me in. She became my carpenter, stonemason, and bricklayer, piling me up cell by cell, the blade that shaped my legs, my arms, my surveyor, millwright. She used herself as a template, her genes tough, her organs elastic, her eyes and nose, forehead and mouth. And when her body, from which my body was made, was slipped into the hot retort, I burned too. She refused the beveled casket, the oiled mahogany box, last drawer for the dead, wanted only the fury of fire, the blue-white flames unmaking her with their licking tongues. House her grandmother built, and her grandmother before her, all of them giving what they had been given, the hardwood floors, staircases, and banisters, their deepest cupboards, their heavy doors flung wide so the breeze I would be could blow through.
Beautiful poem. Thank you for reading it. I thought it might be nice. I didn't know, Chloe, if there was a different poem that occurred to you, but I was thinking in the spirit of Spirit Level, if you might tell us a little bit about natural history on page 17 for anyone who might be following along, and a little bit about how, as we just saw in Dorianne's poem, some of the kind of objects carry with them a sort of soul and a history, and how you kind of contend with that in your poem. This is just one of many that occurred to me.
Thank you. And Dorianne, I love that poem so much. It's just masterful. And I also think one of the great things that poem does, which Salt is doing, and then which when I go back to Only as the Day is Long and all your earlier work, it's really amazing how you're able to use a sort of a story of an everyday object to help us rethink our relations to one another and the way those are constantly changing and evolving. And that's something I love hearing you say, that, you're going to keep writing these poems about your mother forever. It feels like we just, in each poem, we get to know a little more about that relationship, which continues infinitely and deepens and becomes complex in different ways. I love that poem. Okay, so natural history. Actually, my mother's in this poem. I haven't written tons of poems about my mother, at least not yet. But there's a poem about also an everyday thing at the Museum of Natural History in New York City. If anybody's ever been there, they have all these very old school dioramas of dead stuffed animals, right? Which are kind of a little bit sad now. We see, I go now and think, really, you killed the wolves. But of course, they're amazing in that we get to go there and visit those same animals kind of over the generations. So I didn't grow up in New York. My parents are from New York. I grew up in Massachusetts, and we would go visit my grandparents, and we would go to that museum. And even as they have like remodeled the museum over time, many of those dioramas have stayed kind of untouched. So even when I go back now, it's really, I think they're like a time capsule of something somebody made. They're a literal box with a diorama. This poem is about the one of the Arctic wolves bounding through the snow, but they're also very much a time capsule for me because generations of my family have been going and looking at the same thing. So I guess this is kind of a reflection on time poem. Natural history. They've been dead for decades, since long before I was born. My mother saw them on school trips, 2 white wolves caught mid-leap, suspended in eternal blue twilight, endless Arctic summer. I stand just where I can see the darkness inside their panting mouths, the empty air between their front feet and the unbroken crust of snow. They haven't landed on it yet, though they throw their shadows ahead of them. It's almost inevitable that the tail of the left one will graze that low-hanging branch, and a few wet clumps of snow will shower down as they pass. The painted northern lights, the flat horizon line they run to. I am 8 watching them, and 19 and 40. The silent velocity of their feet, of my heartbeat in the dark, the pockmark panic of rabbit tracks before them in the snow. Thanks.
Yeah, we have to give the visual snaps. All sorts of comments are coming in, people talking about how beautiful the poems are, and, how meaningful it is to hear you both read them. I'm struck too, Chloe, in that poem, and in a second I'll pass it over to Dorianne in case she wants to say anything, but I'm struck in that poem, the reference, now I've closed my book here, but I am 8:40. Wait, hold on, what was it? I'm 8 watching them and 19 and 40. And I think it speaks back to what we were talking about before about how every poem has multiple lives and every experience has multiple lives depending on who's doing the looking and at what stage. So I really appreciate how that poem kind of brings together so many of the things we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great poem. Well, I think we probably have time for one final question. Dorianne, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were going to say something. Okay, got it. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to make it a sort of fun one for anyone watching. We've been hearing a lot about the supply chain problems and how people should start doing their, gift giving early. I want to make a recommendation that people order early a certain 2 books that maybe they've heard about recently, and sort of get some priorities going on that. I thought maybe present company excluded, you guys might be willing to offer the listeners some insights into poems and poets who have really excited you lately and sort of thrilled you with like new voices, or any books that you feel like maybe haven't gotten a ton of attention that you feel like you would like to give a shout out to. Oh, Dorianne, you're muted. I know people want to hear it.
I have so many students who are publishing books right now. And I have to say, the books I've been reading that I love are by my students. So, I hate to be self-serving, and although I don't get anything out of it, I guess
they've had a good teacher.
Self-serving, but no, they were talented when they came. I just guided some of their reading and had lunch with them. But 2 students, especially right now, Leila Shati, who's Tunisian American, is writing exquisite poems. Her book Deluge is beautiful. Tyree Day, Daye, you know Tyree's work, exquisite poet, unlike anything you've ever read. Writes poems about the South, you know, and his Southern family and his roots and the diaspora. They're just beautiful writers, you know. And then also student Matt Wimberly just came out with a brand new book. And they just keep coming, you know, all these wonderful students. And so just go online and look up Student of Dorianne Laux, and whatever book they publish, just buy it. Yeah.
There's something in the water there in North Carolina you guys got going.
Yeah.
What a powerhouse group, too. Thank you so much, Dorianne. How about you, Chloe?
Those are amazing recs, by the way. I'm excited to read those new books too. I also feel like I can't recommend my students because my students are all undergrads. They're not publishing books yet. But there's just such an abundance of amazing poetry being written right now.
Right.
Books that I've read recently and taught recently that I've loved are, I would say, the newest Ross Gay, Beholding, a book-length book, which is sort of about basketball, but it's also about like memory and family and slavery in America and history, and how we look at each other, right? That's a great one. I'm really excited to read Patrick Rosal's new and collected that just came out, but I haven't read it yet. So that's one that is on like my to-do list. And another one that I've read this year that I loved and have sort of like kept picking up and putting down and dipping back into. We were talking about sonnets, of course. Diane Seuss's Frank, just sort of like,
so
remakes the sonnet and is just a heartbreaker and an amazement of a book. So that's one.
And remakes the poem while she's at it, you know. I mean, you just can't believe the stuff that she deems worthy of a poem. And you're like, well, of course, why didn't we do this before?
Yes. You know? And the turns those poems take are just incredible. You're deposited somewhere at the end of the poem where you just had no idea that's even a place you could go, right?
Yeah.
And this reminds me that anyone who did not see Diane Seuss and Danica Kelly on Poets in Conversation last summer can check out the archives where we were talking about their very amazing collections. I'm sure that they all appreciate your recommendations, and I do too. So I have to thank you both so much for the pleasure of hearing from you, and especially hearing your poems and chatting with you this afternoon. I want to remind everyone to go out and find Salt and 10,000 Selves. One more flash here. We have in the chat links to both books. And of course, don't forget Only as the Day is Long. One of the books I read last year that made me even want to do this series, because I thought, wow, there's really exciting stuff going on out here in poetry. And so thank you both again for your inspiring words today. For anyone watching, again, please go out and find the books. If you're interested in learning more about Poets in Conversation or A Mighty Blaze, or being reminded about events, etc., you can join us on Facebook, and you can click like or get reminders for events, etc. Go find us, and you can be reminded about Poets in Conversation and our many other great programs that are on all the time. With a final thank you to Dorianne Laux and Chloe Martinez, an encouragement again for everyone to go out and find their beautiful books. This was just a snippet, so now you need the full meal. So thanks to all for watching. Please join us again next month at Poets in Conversation. And thank you once again to Dorianne Laux and Chloe Martinez.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Chloe.
Thanks so much. Such a pleasure.